Okay, so now we've done the sort of housekeeping things, we'll just get going. First thing to say is the session is being recorded, so I'll make a recording and the slides available on the Pearson Music community page in a few days' time as well. There's a link to that in the last slide as well, so you can find the way to the Pearson Music community page as well. Slides are available in the materials section, so if you want to download them, you can do that as well. And finally, the other thing is we do have a chat box here, so if you do want to ask any questions, there should be time at the end. Hopefully shouldn't take the full hour with this, so there should be time to go through any questions that you do have. So feel free to type questions in there, and I'll try and catch some as we go through if they come in. But if not, well, I'll try and get through everything at the end of the session as well. Okay, so if we get going on this, so the main thing that we'll do is go through an overview of the situation, run through what the consultation outcomes were, look at the evidence that you might consider when coming up with the teacher assessed grade. There are some things that still need to be confirmed, so I'll just run through those as well, and then just have a look at what you should and can be getting on with now, and obviously when you return to school from next week. So most of you will know all this anyway, that obviously that there was the announcement made on the 6th of January that schools would be closed and that GCSEs and A-level exams wouldn't go ahead as planned this summer. Then on the 13th of January, there were letters sent between DfE and Ofqual to outline the process and to agree that alternative arrangements for exams would be in place for 2021. Then on the 15th of January, the consultations for the alternative arrangements for GCSEs, AS and A-levels was released. There was also a consultation for vocational qualifications released on that day as well. And that closed on the 29th of January. There's a link there that goes through to that consultation page where you can find the outcomes as well. And then during that time as well, JCQ released a notice to centres about NEA, and that detailed that the NEA components for qualifications could be completed outside of the normal controls due to closures and isolation. So that meant that, for example, compositions wouldn't need to be done with the sort of controls that are in place about that 5 hours completed in the centre under supervised conditions, and including the final write-up and recording. So there's a bit more flexibility about that. And it would allow students to complete work outside of the centre if they were able to, but teachers would still need to be able to authenticate the work as the student's own. Then just the other week, we got the outcomes from Ofqual on the consultation, and there's a link there through to the actual document as well. And then on that day as well was a new consultation that was published on agreeing the alternative awarding framework for general qualifications, and that runs until the 11th of March, and there's a link there to that, so please feel free to have a look at that, and that's open for comments and feedback as well. So we'll run through the main points of the consultation outcomes. So obviously the main thing was around the grades and how they would be decided. So it was said that teachers must assess their students' performance only on what content has been delivered to them to determine the grade. So that's taking into account that different centres are going to be in different situations with delivering the content to students throughout this year. And therefore, the grades that you'll come up with should only be decided on the content that has been delivered to them. Teachers, you can use evidence of a student's performance from throughout the course as well. So that's all the time that they've spent on the course and the evidence that you have gathered and generated in that time as well. So teachers should determine the grades as late in the academic year as possible, and that's to enable teaching to continue and the delivery of content to continue as well. And obviously the grade that you come up with is about the where the student is performing at that point. So it should be done as late as possible. Okay. Okay, looks like a couple of people are having some problems seeing the slides move on. So not sure why that is, because other people seem fine with that. That may be a connection issue, but you can certainly download the slides and go through them alongside this if there are problems with going through that as well. Then, so a broad range of evidence across the talk content to determine the grade should be used. So that can mean lots of things that you can take into account. Obviously, we've got performing and composing for GCSE music, and then you've got the set works to work through as well. There will be heads of centre will have to confirm that students have been taught sufficient content to allow progression. So that's going to be part of the declaration that will be in place for heads of centres to sign and authenticate. So they will have to confirm that there has been sufficient content taught. And then the other thing that is obviously quite a big thing with music, because it's such a large part of the course, is that students should continue work on NEA where that's possible. So NEA will be marked by teachers and will contribute to the overall grade, but there isn't a requirement from the outcomes for the exam boards to moderate that. Okay, so that's quite a big thing. So you'll be using the published assessment grids from the specification to mark the NEA work as you normally would in terms of internally assessing that, but there's no requirement for exam boards to moderate it. Okay, and then last point on that is that it's no easier or harder to achieve a particular grade compared to previous years. I'm seeing a couple of questions come in. So just have a quick look at that. Are we able to use classwork and homework as part of the evidence? Yep, so that is part of it. I'll be coming onto that in a little bit as well. What is NEA? So non-examined assessment, also known as coursework. Probably if you're going to cover this later, is there a final deadline for us to collect NEA grades in and determine a grade? So DfE said that the teacher assessed grades should be submitted to exam boards by the 18th of June. Obviously that is a final date to get all of those completed and submitted. Your centre may have some other deadlines that they will put in place to make sure that that deadline is met as well. So we won't be specifying an exact deadline to complete certain things like that, but obviously it's all working around the 18th of June deadline. With regards to GCSE composition, not been possible. Some students continue work outside the centre due to accessing specialist software. How complete should work be to help form final judgments? Thinking in relation to potential moderation of grades. With NEA, and I think I'll come on to this again in a little bit, it's as much as you deem possible to come up with a mark and then to inform the grade of that. There will be further guidance coming out around components where it isn't possible, that haven't been completed to a point where you can mark the work as well. So there will be further guidance on what to do with those sorts of components and how to consider them as well. Is it still one composition now? As a change at the start of the academic year. So yeah, so the changes that were in place at the start of the academic year stand for what you would consider as the evidence. Not submitting composition and performance with PATH and CAS forms to Pearson. So there's no requirement for exam boards to moderate the work. With that, which year's grade boundaries would you use for the NEA? I don't think we'll particularly specify to use a particular year's grade boundaries, but for the notional grade boundaries for performing and composing, I don't think they particularly change year on year. They're very similar. Okay. Work in a really small school, I only have 3 students. Can I use the knowledge I have of students through verbal conversation questioning as evidence? I'll come on to things like that in a little bit, but there's a kind of way to consider the evidence that you would have, and also to consider that there is potential for a student to appeal, and the evidence that you use would be submitted along with that as well. Okay, just aware of time and don't want to spend too much time on going through this. Should penalties still be applied to performances under the time limit? That's something that you would have to consider in the marking if it meets the requirements of the spec. So we need NEA evidence for later queries. Can the performance, or that's just disappeared on us, still be audio only? So you can, for this year, we put in the adaptation that performances could be audio or video as well. So that's something that you can consider. Can we use the work that pupils did during lockdown? Yeah, so work that's done in lockdown can be considered, and I'll be getting onto that as well in a minute. So just simply 1 grade awarded by the school, no need to break down the components. No, so although you'll be marking the NEA and considering that, and it should sort of carry the weight that it normally would in the in the qualification, you'll be submitting a grade for that student, for each student. Okay. Okay, yeah, big difference, grade bounds between November 20, June 19. There was a particular difference with the November series, as the standards for the summer 2020 needed to be maintained in the autumn series, and it was a very small cohort that sat the 2020 paper, so it's not particularly representative of the full cohort that would normally sit a paper. So it's very difficult to come up with the same and accurate grade boundaries for that paper, the same as any other year. So I think the grade boundaries around the 20 paper are an outlier in those that way. Would view covering the one remaining set work as more or less important than completing the NEA? I think it's all as particularly as important to try and get completed as far as possible. How you would view that and consider that when you're coming up with a grade, that's something that you would need to consider. So yeah, appraising component, surely we need to be using the same grade boundaries. It's not particularly going on a particular set of grade boundaries. It is around considering the grade overall that a student would get. Obviously that does change year on year slightly with the grade boundaries, but you are comparing that with similar candidates from previous years as well, to consider where each candidate could potentially lie in terms of grade as well. But there will be further guidance coming out around all of this as well. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So part of this, and as I said, there will be a requirement for examples to provide a package of support materials to centres. That will include questions, mark schemes, data around the performance on those questions, and some exemplar material. The full content around that still needs to be decided on what that will look like, but what we've kind of looked at this point is breaking it down into set works more. So you would get groups of questions around particular set works, mark schemes, and the data around that as well. What was also said in the statement from the Minister around the time of the consultation that was released, the consultation outcomes were released, was that he would like to see a proportion of unseen material, so unseen questions for each subject as well. So in those questions there may well be some questions that have come from past papers, and there may be some unseen material in that as well, so new material. So in the packages we would have to consider what resources go in there, but we are looking at the audio extract and the scores to accompany that to whatever extent we need to, depending on what questions we cover there as well. So teachers will be able to use the support materials up until the deadline for the submission of grades, and the other important thing to note is that the use of support materials isn't compulsory. They will be part of a range of evidence that teachers could use, but it's not compulsory to use the support material. Obviously, people are now asking when you'll have that support material. I haven't got a firm date on that yet. All of these things are being discussed at the moment, of what will actually be included in there and how we can provide that. Obviously, we are aiming to provide that as soon as possible to help support teachers, but I don't have a firm date for that at this point. I think the support materials will probably be provided on the website. Again, I haven't, all the details of how this will be provided haven't been confirmed as yet, but yeah, we'll obviously be contacting centres as best we can in terms of my updates and mail outs to exams officers and everything like that, with the full range of support materials for all subjects as well. So when completing the forms, competition performance, will there be an adapted version? So it's just one competition, one performance. Yet they're on the website at the moment, so they were produced earlier in the year. Are there a minimum number of set work students should have covered? Not particularly. That's not something that we are saying that there's a particular number that need to be covered in there. Still the same. So NEA deadline is kind of not really in place anymore as in terms of submitting stuff. It's moving to the teacher assessed grade, so that will be coming in. So I could just focus on one or two set works, and if these are the only ones we have covered in depth. So as it's said earlier, that the grade should be based on whatever content you have covered with your students. If you have covered other set works, maybe not as in depth, you've still covered them to some extent, and that's what you've got to consider when you are coming up with this grade as well. Okay, so exam boards will work together as far as possible to ensure consistency for internal and external quality assurance. So one of the things that's still to be confirmed, and I'll mention this in a bit, is the quality assurance process required from centres, and what quality assurance checks exam boards will do. But there's an outline that there will be some centre quality assurance arrangements where you will have to have grades signed off by probably 2 members of staff, and there will be a head of centre declaration as well. Then there will be exam board external quality assurance checks as well, and this could be a sample of centres where we'll request the evidence to review for one or a range of subjects. So there will be some quality assurance checks in that way, and then results will only be processed after the external quality assurance process has been completed as well. And then, as I said earlier, there will be a head of centre declaration that will be required when all the grades are submitted by a centre. Then we've got students will be able to appeal their grade. The first way that they should do that, if they are unhappy with the grade, is actually speak to the centre, and then the centre should check if there's a procedural or admin error. If there isn't, then the centre could look at that and submit a revised grade and a rationale to the exam board for consideration. If that rationale is accepted, then a revised grade can be issued. However, if centre don't think that there is an error or at all, student can ask the centre to appeal to the exam board on their behalf. The centre would then submit the student's appeal and provide the evidence on which they've made their judgment to the exam board to be considered, and that's where it could change or it could stay the same. I've just noticed something which didn't change from an A-level session that I ran for A-level Music Tech the other day, where it says results day will be the 10th of August. For GCSE, results day will be the 12th of August. So that's just one thing that changes there. So results day will be on the 12th of August. Then looking on to the evidence that you may consider, which is probably covering a lot of the questions that have come in, which I will look back through in a minute as well. So student work produced in response to assessment materials provided by the exam board. That's including groups of questions, could be past papers or any similar materials such as the practice papers or sample papers that we have provided. You can consider any A work, even if it hasn't been fully completed. So if there is a performance or a composition that's not fully completed, you can still consider that when you are looking at the grade as well. You can consider student work produced in centre devised tasks that try and reflect the specification and the same format as the exam board materials. So that could be a homework, for example. So I remember someone asking about that earlier in the questions there. It could be internal tests, it could be mock exams. So these are things that you could consider when coming up with a grade. And then you've got things such as records of students' capability and performance over the course of study in performance-based subjects. So you could have recordings of previous performances. You could have how they performed maybe in a graded exam as well. And then you've got records of each student's progress and performance over the course of study as well. And when you're looking at this, obviously there is a balance to how you consider this evidence and how important it is in the weighting that it has on the grade that you decide. And obviously part of that is going to be around when the evidence was produced, how early in the course was that produced, how reflective of their current ability is that piece of evidence. What students were asked to do, does it actually replicate what the specification is trying to do, or an exam material, for example, that that you've used, and then also how the evidence was produced. What sort of controls was it under? As there, may be a difference between work that was produced at home under lockdown and work they may produce under controlled conditions in a classroom under some sort of supervision. So these are things that you will consider when you are coming up with the teacher assessment assessed grade there. As I said, there are some things still to be confirmed. The full details of the quality assurance processes still need to be confirmed, and there's obviously discussions ongoing around that and what that may look like. We've still got to confirm the exact content of the support material and how it will be available. And as I said as well, how to approach NEA components. If there is no meaningful evidence available, there will be further guidance coming on that as well. And then the final point that still needs to be confirmed, as the consultation left it open for exam boards to decide on this for themselves, if they continue to offer the exams to international centres or not. And this is something that Pearson haven't confirmed just yet. We are hoping, I think, to have an update this week to confirm that as well. But we haven't confirmed as yet if exams may go ahead for international centres or not. Yeah, and I understand that certain centres in certain places will be closed. The other thing to add on to that is that the consultation did say if possible as well. So I think there are certain areas and certain countries where that may not be possible to go ahead anyway, and then that will be a decision of what happens there. But just to say that there's no decision as yet, but I think that we should hopefully hear something this week and have that confirmed. So really, it's what to do now, and when you do return to the centre. So obviously, from the off-qual outcomes and the statements from DFE, it's to continue to deliver the content for the exam components. So obviously, component 3, appraising. The intention is that teaching should continue as late as possible in the year to allow the grades submitted to reflect the student ability at that point. So these should continue as as late as possible. You should also probably consider if you will use the support material when it becomes available to help inform the grade, and what evidence that you will be using. Start to think about that. Also, students should continue with NEA where that is possible. Obviously, the JCQ notice allows that to happen outside of the centre under certain conditions, and that's detailed in their notice. But obviously recognising if it's done in outside of the centre, there may be some problems with access to resources for music and music technology subjects in particular. But when you are back in centre as well, that could be a time for when that is a chance to get some of this covered as well. And then also considering that grades will need to be submitted by 18th of June, consider when you will mark that NEA to help inform the grades there as well. There is also, as I said, the consultation that's currently running around the framework for the alternative awarding arrangements. So please do read that and offer feedback if you want as well to Ofqual. And there's some other draft documents on that page that are also part of that consultation. So please do review those as well and provide comments. On this page, there's a link to the contact portal. So if you do have any further questions, please submit them through there after this session. And there is also a link to the Pearson Music Community page where I'll post the recording and the slides as well. But now I do have a chance to go back through some of these questions that have come in. I will try and have a look back as far as I got. So someone just asked about similar situation apply to A-level. Yeah, so very similar situation for A-level, really, in this. So is it possible to have questions there? Yeah, so some centres have only covered a few works in depth and others have tried to cover all of the set work. Surely this puts centres try to do the latter at a disadvantage as their students won't have the same depth. This thing in this year, there will be different situations in different centres, and that's why you are only going to base your grade on the content that you have covered. So you may have covered some set works in depth and be able to base your grade off of that content that you've covered. Other centres may have covered all the set works but not in as much depth, and that's the evidence that you'll have to consider when you're coming up with the grade, when you're going through that. So there will be different situations for different centres, and there's no way of changing that because different centres will approach the delivery of content in different ways and would have approached the delivery through the lockdowns in different ways as well. So it is trying to find a situation where teachers can decide on the grade using their knowledge and their situation for their students. Okay, difficult situation with many schools having totally different circumstances. Yeah, so I think allow us to use some professional judgment. Yeah, so that's kind of covering that as well. Just trying to go through, keeping this all in mind as we come around to revision. Would it be in the student's best interest to focus on a few set works rather than all of them? So the grades on this, considering most of the course has been taught online. So, I mean, at this point, I don't think you'll be particularly doing revision as such because there won't be an exam at the end of this course. There, you can use tests and the questions that can be provided in part of the support package. But I think the general idea coming from DfE and Ofqual on this is to continue with delivery of content as late in the year as possible to help inform your grade that you will come up with. Been teaching all the set works, annotating and doing musical dictation. Try and use all the marks they have been able to get for all the remote learning so far. Yeah, so remote learning is fine to use as evidence in there. I'm familiar. That just disappeared off my screen. Just trying to find that question again. There it is. So as I said, the content of the support materials is still to be decided on what that may all include. And it's also fair to say that it's not expecting it to be a full mock exam that you cover, and it's up to you the types of questions that you use and the material that you use to decide on your grade. But this is just giving you some ideas of what could potentially lead to that as well. Listening for students for this cohort. Like exam with a view to doing our own mock papers. Yep. So could we have grade profiles like ones produced for A-level? Yeah, so I think part of the support package as well, and what has been suggested, is there would be some grade profiles provided, maybe not for every grade, but for maybe alternate grades that was suggested. So again, still not confirmed what will be available with all of that, but I know that that was mentioned. Are we allowed to share any A marks with students? Students are keen to know how they've done it in a previous recording session. What is unclear is what you can share with students. From what I've read out the consultations, there was no clear instruction about sharing grades and marks and things like that. However, in the consultation that runs to the 11th of March, I believe there's something in there around that the grades should be kept secure and confidential up until results day. So I think with that, you are allowed to share the types of evidence that you've used to decide on marks, but nothing around the particular grade in there as well. Okay. Unfortunately, I've now lost exactly where I was with the questions because they keep scrolling. So will there be any guidance on how to approach students who have extenuating circumstances? Again, with that, I believe you would consider any access arrangements that would be in place as you consider their grade, as well as if they would have that to help them in that component of the exam, in the component, the qualification, sorry. Just trying to find all of the questions going through. Someone asked, do we send evidence in with teacher assessed grades or keep this for appeal? So at this point, I don't think we'll be asking for any evidence to come in alongside the teacher assessed grades. That will be something that you do keep hold of in case of any appeals or anything like that. Can we use different evidence for different students? The pupil was isolating with their mock exam was taken or set work was covered. Could we use different evidence for them and throughout the cohort? I think on the whole, you would try and use the same evidence for every candidate. But obviously in this year, there may be a situation, for example, where a student wasn't able to take a mock exam at a certain time due to isolating, then obviously with that you could consider a different bit of evidence in that time that they've taken. How will Pearson take into account the schools countries who have government enforced closures when deciding if exams should go ahead? I mean, the decision if exams go ahead will be on a sort of whole Pearson scale. So I don't think it will be specifically just for music, but I think it will be looked at in terms of which countries and how many countries are still do have closures and are still unable to open schools. Is there going to be anything similar soon for BTEC? There is some BTEC events that are planned for later this month, I think nearer the end of the month. I'm not sure if they're on the training schedule on the Pearson website as yet, but they are certainly coming. Right, just we need to share evidence with students so they know how we arrive at their grade. Yeah, so you can share the types of evidence that you've used to decide their grade. That's, I believe, the wording from the consultation in there. Yeah, so if you, so details about an A-level webinar you could share perhaps. So I'm running an A-level session tomorrow at this time as well. If you go to the Pearson Music Community page link that's there, there is a link to sign up there. I think there are still places available. However, I would say that most of what I will say in the A-level session will be exactly the same that's come out of this session as well. So it will just be slightly adapted for A-level to look at the different types of things in there. So you could decide if you take an essay question into sort of consideration or not. It's the type of evidence that you hold and will consider will vary centre on centre. So that's kind of there. Can we choose to narrow down the set works to 6 out of 8? I understand what you say about the level of depth, but revising 8 set works is vastly different from revising 6. So it's about the content that you have delivered and will deliver to your candidates. So you'll consider how they have performed throughout the course and the content that you have covered with them. So I think at this point it's moving away from the thought of revision as such, but in terms of delivering, making sure you've delivered content and have evidence in place so you can have an informed teacher assessed grade for each candidate. It's a really complicated situation, as even compared with the previous year. Each school is going to be very different. Yep. How on earth is anyone going to be able to check that the results are fair? Even looking at past performances this year is entirely unique. So, I mean, the quality assurance checks that will be in place, there will be internal quality assurance checks that centres will have to do, and then there will be some external quality assurance checks done by exam boards as well. And part of what a centre would need to consider when they're coming up with their grades is actually referring to their previous grade profiles and how that matches as well, and if there's any situations that would mean that changes. So that is something that would need to be considered in there. Can we give a student personally at home recorded performance the same way as one we would normally have witnessed? Yeah, I think if it's a video performance and you can see the student performing, then there's nothing wrong with that, and you can add as much weight to that. If it's an audio of them performing, but you're confident that it's them and you know their standards, then I don't think that would be any particular problem as well, if you are confident that it's actually them as well. These elements can be assessed on work completed at home during lockdown. I would say yes. Yeah, would be acceptable for a centre to change the weighting of the components, e.g. 80-20, due to constraints. So the weighting of the components and the weighting of the evidence in terms of the NEA is intended to be similar and stay the same, but you've got to consider the evidence that you have available as well. And as I said, there will be more guidance coming out for if it's not possible to look at an NEA component where there's not the evidence there to consider. So would it be possible to have specific grade boundaries for each component sent out to us? So all the previous grade boundaries are available on the website, and you can download them there. If you just go on the Pearson website and search grade boundaries, that will take you there, and then you can access all of those. If we assess dictation ability, can we use evidence based on work done and still related to set works? Yeah, so I think that's absolutely fine as well. So the dictation question was intended to change slightly, where it could be from a set work or it could be a piece of unfamiliar music for 2021. So it could potentially still come from a set work in exams. So marks for NEA are given back every year, so I assume that this is fine. Let's tell students if we think their performance will come out as full marks, so they don't have to re-record. Yeah, so internally marked NEA, usually you would give those marks back and allow a student time to appeal against that internally. Obviously, this is a different situation this year, but as I said, there's seems to be information around grades, but nothing around particular marks or anything like that with that. I've been asking students to send in regular performances if we're unable to record in school, which slightly continue to ask them. Yeah, so that's fine. What are your thoughts about evidencing melodic dictation and unfamiliar listening? I think with that, you've got to base it on the evidence that you hold. If you've gone through things like that and you have evidence that you can refer to in any mock exams or anything like that, then that's something that you will consider as part of your evidence. Do CAS and PAS forms need to be completed at all? I think it could be useful to complete them when you're looking at the NEA components, but as I said, there's no requirement for examples to moderate, and therefore I don't think we'll be asking for them to be submitted in any way. Are we making a grade judgments based on evidence that forecasts a grade or evidence of the actual grade that particular work shows? So the grade that you give for the teacher assessed grade should be based on the student's performance at that time, based on all the evidence you have available. So it does differ from last year's grade, where it was based on potential that they would achieve. This year it has changed to be based on their grade that they are working at. So that's detailed in the outcomes as well. Focused a lot on the elements of music individually, composing and creating pieces around these. Took over from previous teachers. There's very little hard evidence from the learning from this time. It's based on class discussion and questioning. Since I base this on my professional opinion, no, or shall I try and do some mock exams in the time they're back? I think certainly when you get back, there is the opportunity and time to do some tests. They might not be full mock exams, but there could be some questions and things that you could do to cover that. Is there another link I could access for the A-level webinar? It says error when I click on the link provided. Okay, I'll post that in at the end of the session when I've done that, finished answering some of these questions. Is it okay for students to perform without accompaniment, even if the piece should have it? I think in this year, If it's possible to have accompaniment, then great. If it's not going to be possible, then that's going to be acceptable. If you can try and arrange something, even if it's a backing track or something like that, to add the context to the performance for your benefit when you're looking at it and marking it, then I think that would be helpful as well. Do we need to have fully completed scores for their compositions? I think that's going to be on the evidence that you're going to have available. If they can complete scores, then again, that's going to be helpful. If it's not possible to fully complete a score, then you'll be basing it on the evidence that you do have. So you'll be basing it on their composition, and I'm presuming that you'll have some sort of recording of that that's submitted as well. Regarding surely, if we are going to give evidence that students may progress and improve their grades over the course, we will still be giving them tests that this will involve revision, although we might not be able to go over all of the set works in that time. Yep. So, I mean, it's kind of what I'm saying. It's you wouldn't particularly be going full out revision delivery as you would, but yes, you would be going over some sort of tests and questions maybe that would cover content that you would have delivered earlier. So you may want to cover some of that again. Could I use music dictation tests from a practice booklet? Yeah, I mean, again, that could help inform student performance as well. So there's no requirement to have physical evidence of every type of question on the exam. No, it's going to be the evidence that you hold in your centre and what's possible that will inform the grade. So someone else asking about what grade boundaries to use for the exam element. We're not going to dictate that at this point, but I think looking at previous grade boundaries, so look at 2018, look at 2019, and look at the shift in that and how that may differ slightly, but I'd be using it and using that as a guide. Can pupils write a commentary to accompany their score as part of evidence? Yeah, they can do that in any year. So I think having that commentary can highlight specific elements around the composition that can help a marker when they are looking at that as well. Grade boundaries to follow for component 3. If we all use different years, that limits the possibility for consistency. Yeah, so as I said, I think previous grade boundaries can be used, and you can look at both 2018 and 19 for that. As I said, 2020 is a bit of an outlier because of the autumn series and the size of cohort. But it's around also having this no harder or easier to achieve a particular grade than previous years, so you can start to consider previous cohorts and where your candidates sit within that as well. And was the exam created this year? So will this be posted on the system to use with year 11? Obviously, exam papers do get written in advance and well in advance. And again, I'm not totally sure because the content hasn't been confirmed as yet, but for the support package and the questions and the suggestion that it does include some unfamiliar, unseen questions, there is potential that questions could come from that paper that they included on that in that support package as well. Someone come in to record the performances, and we have a week block out to do recordings, but this is not going to happen this year. Looks like you'll be asking students to record at home and send in to me. Not have accompaniment yet, so that's fine to have it that way, and that's one way to look at things. Okay, that's interesting about the okay, so people, there's some problem with the link going through to the community. So if you just bear with me 1 minute, I will just post a link in the chat. Just going to the page to grab the link now. Okay, so hopefully you should have that there. So that's a link going through to the community, and there's a pinned post at the top with the links through to the other support sessions that I'm running. Okay, oh, well, download a presentation, but it says, okay, yeah, so done that. So do we double the 1 times comp, 1 times performance scores, so they equal 60 instead of 30 for each? Yeah, so if it had gone ahead as a normal series alternate with the adaptations where it was 1 composition, 1 performance, you would have submitted marks out of 30, and then we would have used a scaling factor to give the correct weighting for the qualification overall. So essentially that would have made it up to 60 marks, so that would essentially just double the marks there. So when you're considering that and looking at how you would look at that, and if you're looking at giving marks for the overall qualification, then that's an approach that you could do there. Okay, I think that has answered everything. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you found the session useful. So the slides are available to download now in the materials section. If not, I will be posting the recording on the community page in the next few days as well, along with the slides. But I will stop there, and hopefully, as I said, you found it useful. I hope you all have a pleasant evening.